Welcome everybody to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about legal and strategic perspectives on how nonprofits can promote a healthy workplace culture during COVID-19. So it's great to have you on here. I'm seeing so many familiar faces as well as several new ones as well. So thanks for doing that introduction in the chat. So glad you all could join us today. Joining us today on the speakers panels, we have Kalyan Ingram from Cunningham Swan Lawyers and Jonathan Bennett from Laridae. So Jonathan will be speaking to us today about the strategic perspectives of promoting a healthy workplace culture during COVID-19, while Kalen will be offering us the legal perspectives on these issues. And my name is Valentina, and I'm a consultant with Laridae, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box and making sure that we get to as many of your questions as possible. And we also have Alnis joining us from Laridae, and he will be on tech support. So if you have any tech troubles at any point, please feel free to send him a private message, and he will be able to help you out. So just a couple of quick pointers on Zoom. Try to make sure your Zoom is on full screen, so that'll help you focus in on the conversation and minimize the other distractions coming in. We're going to be running today till 2:30. We will hang around a couple minutes afterwards. We'll sort of close the formal part of the webinar and then hang around for a couple of minutes if you want to stay and just say hi to Jonathan or Kalen or ask a follow-up question. And to ensure that today that you can see the panelists as they're talking, we recommend that you select speaker view on your Zoom screen rather than gallery view. So it's totally up to you, but in gallery view, you'll see everyone who's on the webinar, where in speaker view, you might get that more nice zoomed in view of Jonathan and Kalen as they're speaking. And if you get disconnected at any time during the session, please feel free to join back in. Just use the same link that we sent you over the email, and you can join us if it's before 2:30. And we're encouraging your questions today. So if you have any questions, type them into the chat box at any time. We really want to hear from you. But like I said, we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. We only have an hour today, so we'll try to get through whatever content we can. And we're committed to doing more of these as we go and as it's useful. So if there are a lot of questions and there's a lot of interest, it's something that we can always look to revisiting in the future. So if that sounds good, I'm going to hand it over in a second to Jonathan and Kalen, but I just wanted to give a couple of words just about the overview of today's session. So as many of you know, Laridae works only with nonprofit and public sector organizations across the province and across Canada. And we've had a long-standing partnership now with Cunningham Swan LLC. We've done a number of these events, usually in person in the past, pre-COVID, and we've really enjoyed working with them because we find there's a lot of alignment in the types of clients that we work with and the sort of approach that we have when working with clients from those different perspectives, so from strategy and the legal and HR law perspective. So we're really pleased that Kalen was able to join us today for the third time that we're coming together, and we're really here to help share some knowledge with our friends in the nonprofit sector and to try to be of service. So why are we having this conversation today? What we're finding is that the real purpose of today is that we're at a bit of a turning point right now. So we're starting to see some restrictions related to COVID starting to ease, and we're finding that it's putting a particular pressure on nonprofits who are at times serving some of the most vulnerable populations. And so we've been getting a lot of questions, managers, leaders have questions, their staff have questions. And so what we wanted to do is provide a bit of access to Jonathan and Kalen so that you could ask your questions and get a bit of that legal perspective and a workplace culture perspective as we sort of are in this transition point. And as things start to reopen and, returning to normal for whatever that may mean, although it's not really a normal, it's a new normal, if you will. So we're pleased to come together today. And as I mentioned, we're committed to continue doing these types of things and being of service in whatever way we can. So if you have ideas for how we can be of service, please let us know either today or following up in an email. So I'll hand it over now to Kalen. And Kalen, if you can just, sorry, excuse me, sorry about that. There we go. Kalen, over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Kalyan Ingram, and as Valentina mentioned, I am a lawyer. My practice is specialized in labor and employment law, and we are a management side firm. And we really help our employer clients on really all matters pertaining to the workplace. As Valentina mentioned, we've partnered with Laridae for 2 years, over 2 years now, on a variety of seminars. And I'd really like to thank everyone at Laridae for pulling this together. Alnis, Valentina, Jonathan, and Danielle, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today. We really enjoy this partnership with Laridae, and I echo, Valentina's sentiments. I think there's a lot of we approach things very similarly, so we appreciate their perspective. This has obviously been an eventful couple of months as we have all navigated this pandemic, and for us, a variety of legal issues that have arisen in the workplace. I often comment how employment law is always changing and evolving, and that really keeps life interesting for us. But the amount of change that we have really seen over the past couple of months has really been significant. So I'm very happy to be here and engage in this discussion with all of you about the new realities of the workplace going forward. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Kalen. Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Jonathan Bennett. Many of you, I think, were looking forward to seeing my colleague Danielle Rocheleau, who's the CEO at Laridae, here today, but I've had to do a last-minute substitution. Poor Danielle has broken her arm on the weekend and is in some discomfort, but she's doing well, just to let you all know that. So you have me instead. I hope I'll live up to her billing. So Laridae is, for most of you kind of know us a bit at least. We're a management consulting firm. We're based in Peterborough, but we work right across the province and the country. And largely we do strategy work. And our focus obviously is on nonprofit and public sector organizations. We're a proud B Corporation, which means we are independently accredited around corporate social responsibility, and that's a really important piece of who we are and the work we do. My own expertise is in strat planning. I'm kind of a governance nerd. I spend a lot of time with boards, and I do a lot of board coaching. Inevitably, with consulting work, change management and workplace culture is a huge part of what I do, especially in executive coaching and management training. Like my core kind of competency is in corporate communications. So the extent to which communications is an important part of this new reality that we're all facing right now, and I'm just sure it is, I think that also is a really important lens that I can bring to the discussion. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and to jumping in wherever I can and bringing the strategy and workplace health and culture piece to the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Jonathan. So we're going to dive into the discussion now. And what I'd like to do to get us started is we're actually going to kick off with a poll. So to start, I want to get a sense of what sort of challenges you're facing right now and what's that most pressing issue on your mind. So you're going to see a polling question come up on your screen in a moment. There it is. So the question is, what's your most pressing issue currently? Is it returning to the physical workplace after working remotely? Is it long-term remote work arrangements, such as the implications or the liabilities of that? Maybe it's reintegrating laid off workers. Could be motivation, communications, and engaging your team during this time and afterwards. Or is it performance management in a remote working environment? So if you can take a second to answer that, you probably have more than one concern, but pick the one that's sort of most on your mind right now. Okay, and we'll give a couple of seconds for those answers to come in. Great, I see a lot of people coming in. Okay, final few seconds. Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got the results, and okay, interesting. A big mix of who we've got on the call today, but I'm seeing a bit of a split between returning to the physical workplace after COVID, motivation, communications, and engaging your team, and performance management in a remote working environment. So a bit of a 30-30-30 split. So that's really interesting. And Jonathan, I'm actually going to start with you. What do you think about these results? Does that surprise you, or is that consistent with what you're seeing and hearing from the folks you've been speaking with?
Yeah, that's pretty consistent. I was on a podcast last week talking about the nonprofit sector, and I kind of commented there that we're really seeing a complete mixture, a real mixed bag of what folks are facing right now. I think there's some really practical concerns that workplaces have around, safely and appropriately returning to the physical workplace. Many nonprofits have done unbelievable things to continue to serve their clients, many of whom, are really vulnerable populations. And they've been really inventive and really innovative in order to do that. But quietly, folks are saying, while there's some really interesting things that have happened, in some cases, it's not the very best work and not the very best way that they could be serving folks. And so there's some, sense to returning to the workplace and workspace is going to be really, really important. I obviously say motivation and communications and staying engaged, especially during when people are working remotely, is going to be new for a lot of workplaces, and everybody's just had a trial by fire. I've also heard that leaders have been surprised at the adaptability and the willingness for people to just do the new thing when they wouldn't have imagined 3 or 4 months ago that it would have even been possible. And, performance management, some of the pre-questions that came into us was around performance management. And it's something that we spend a lot of time helping managers and leaders with at Laridae. And I imagine there'll be some questions around, how do you make sure that folks are putting in a good day, that they're doing, the right kind of work and the right level of work? How do you ensure that people are, working in a team-based environment when they're not physically together? So I imagine all of those pieces will come up.
Thanks. Kalen, what about you? Is this similar to what you've been hearing from the people you've been working with recently?
Yeah, I think, we are entering a new reality where, for some workplaces, they have been working remotely and it's been trial by fire. But now that we're beginning to sort of return to the workplace, lots of workplaces are implementing longer term remote work arrangements and trying to figure out the best way to have that unfold in a manner that, keeps projects and tasks and services moving forward. And so, I think a key theme throughout today is communication. And this is obviously one of Jonathan's key areas of expertise, but it's also, something that can avoid or sort of avoid, the legal battle that could ensue if there's a breakdown in communication. So in terms of, a remote working arrangement, setting sort of the ground rules and what are the expectations and how are you going to do performance management when people are working remotely. I think having those things in place ahead of time, communicating it clearly, will really set your workplace up for success and avoid some of the pitfalls that certainly are out there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kalen. I'm interested in how you're talking about the pitfalls and some of the things that can sort of be mitigated by these proactive communications. Any particular things to watch out for? Or can you expand on that a little bit more? What are some of these common pitfalls?
Well, in terms of for a remote working arrangement, what are the expectations in terms of productivity, in terms of the hours of work? When are you expecting your workers to be available? Are you going to have daily check-ins? How are you going to track hours, you know, for workers that are paid hourly? How are you going to track that? Like, these are all things that I think, you know, setting the framework in advance, whether it be just in a written communication or a policy of some sort, just so everyone's clear on how this will run. You know, there's obviously lots of issues with a remote working arrangement, that, you know, beyond just performance management and communication, but things like insurance and confidentiality, security, those types of things. So I think there's lots of these types of issues that require some foresight and, you know, again, communication with your staff, so everyone's on page, and getting their input on what they need to have in place so that, you know, they can be successful in this new arrangement.
Yeah, thanks. And I think we will be diving in a bit more to some of the specifics about this returning to work or having long-term remote arrangements. So that's a really great way to start that discussion. Jonathan, we had a question that came in, and I'm going to send this one to you. What can I do to additionally support my staff through this time? What's different and what stays the same?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's certainly one we're hearing lots about. Well, what stays the same is your organizational values. And I think that's the position that you need to reach back into. What do your values say? And how do they dictate that you've already committed to, as an organization, behave and treat one another? I think that's the sort of the foundational part. You know, maybe your strat plan isn't as in focus because of all the changes that's happened. Maybe there's other guiding documents and guiding strategies that might otherwise have, you know, set your course. But when things get shaken through you know, an event such as COVID, and you're kind of reaching back to where's my foundation, I think really for most organizations, it's your values. And so I think that for most nonprofit organizations, you know, we all come to this work, you know, not for the stock options, right? Like it's because we believe in building better communities and better society. And it doesn't matter what kind of nonprofit you are, you know, you're existing to serve in some way. And so, you know, I think that organizations that are doing the best right now are building from a place of trust. They're not designing, you know, they're designing new ways of working with their individual staff members and teams in general from a position of knowing that people are going through what at the very least is an unusual set of circumstances, but for a lot of people, it's pretty traumatic. They are juggling home life and other things in their lives that you don't really have much of a sight line to as an employer. And you don't know how safe their work environment is at home. You don't know how conducive it is to work. And whether it's just because they've got little kids or whether it's because there's other things that don't make it great space to work. That's a huge additional set of pressures. And, you know, brain chemistry and, you know, and brain literature tells us a lot about what that does to people's ability to be able to kind of quote unquote be productive. And so setting realistic expectations and knowing that, you know, for a while anyway, people might not be at their best is, I think, is okay. And my final message on this, I think, is that people are watching right now. Your staff are watching. And the extent to which you treat them well and you trust them to be as successful as they can through this difficult period, they will remember. And there's a good, I think, opportunity to engender some great loyalty through this.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of great points there, and reinforcing the importance of empathy and compassion during such an unusual time, and time that's been a strain in ways that nobody really could have predicted. And you touched on as well some of those workplace accommodations and that sort of topic, and we have lots of questions on that, which I'm going to get to in just a moment, and I will be directing some of those to you, Kalen, because they're a bit more on the technical side. As we jump into that sort of remote working topic, I want to now to launch one more poll, just to ask a quick question. It's about which of the following have you experienced during COVID? So if you can answer this, which of the following have you experienced? You can choose all that apply. Have you had any shutdown of your organization or seizing of operations, whether temporary or long-term? Have you had to go to a 100% remote work arrangement? Have you had, on the other hand, maybe a mix of remote and non-remote work, so part-time from home, part-time from the workplace, or have you just had continued work, business as usual? So I'm seeing some people thumbs up in the camera, voting through the camera too. That works as well. Okay, so we've got the answers coming in.
I can see people changing their minds.
Well, it is a choose all that applies. So we may have a couple of multiple selection going on.
Right.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm going to end the poll there. Okay, interesting. So about the majority of the people said a mix of remote and non-remote work, part-time home, part-time from the workplace. Some people went fully remote. I know at Laridae, that was what we went to. And some people, yeah, I was expecting some of this, continued business as usual. And naturally, if you're working with some of the most vulnerable and essential service type operations, that would happen, of course. So Kalen, a question building off of that. We've had a few variations of this question come in, so it's something that's on a lot of people's mind. Can you discuss the rights of employees in regards to working if they identify a personal issue? For example, the inability to find childcare or anxiety related to COVID. What's the line between accommodation and undue hardship for the organization?
Yeah, so this has been a really tricky issue. Lots of employers are dealing with this issue of employees expressing some anxiety over returning to work or returning to the workplace. I think first and foremost, I mean, again, I'm coming back to that theme of communication. It's, you know, you need to engage with the employee and try to get at the why. What is the issue that is causing them anxiety? Now, if it is a childcare issue, for instance, the Employment Standards Act was amended when this pandemic hit to introduce a new leave of absence, an infectious disease emergency leave, which is available to employees if they don't have childcare because of the childcare closures. So it might be that your worker has access to this job protected ESA leave. Childcare also engages potentially the Human Rights Code. So, you know, the Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination in the workplace on the basis of a variety of prohibited grounds. So, you know, disability, gender, race. But one of those grounds is family status. So that refers to a worker's relationship with their child or obligations to their children or potentially to their parents. So if a worker comes to you and says, I can't come to work, or I need some accommodations due to my obligations to my children or my obligations to my parents, the Human Rights Code could be engaged and there could be a duty to accommodate. It might be an issue of they have a vulnerable person at home and they don't want to come into the workplace and potentially catch the virus and bring it home with them. It might be their own medical condition. So they might be saying, I have a pre-existing medical condition that makes me more vulnerable. You know, that also could engage the Human Rights Code on the basis of disability. So, if we're talking a Human Rights Code issue, you would be following, the process that you would normally follow in the event that one of your workers were to come to you and say, I can't come into work on Tuesdays until 10 a.m. because of this childcare issue, or I have this medical issue that, requires me to take some time off work. You engage with the employee, you gather information, and you go through this process of determining what would be a reasonable accommodation. The term undue hardship was part of that question, and that would be, the obligation under the Human Rights Code is to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. Now, undue hardship, it's one of these terms that's not easily defined. It varies from situation to situation. I will say that, you know, if you have been one of these workplaces that have, you know, put in place a remote working arrangements for the past couple of months, and you are now trying to bring people back to the workplace, but you have 1 or 2 employees who are saying, I can't really come back to the workplace because of A, B, or C, it will be hard for you to take the position that it would cause an undue hardship to maintain that remote working arrangement. But it really varies from situation to situation. But that undue hardship question is only engaged if the Human Rights Code is engaged. And so what I have seen is that a lot of workers are expressing anxiety, and understandably so. I'm not trying to downplay that anxiety, but they're just expressing anxiety about returning to work. But it's not necessarily, you know, that they have a disability or that they have, you know, a childcare obligation. And so, you know, you really need to engage with those employees, try to get at, well, what is it that you're concerned about? You know, is there something that we can be doing in the workplace to address your concerns? You know, be open about what are the health and safety precautions you're taking to protect your workers, and make it clear to them that, you know, the health and safety of your staff is your #1 priority. And so, you know, trying to, you know, head those discussions off before they get too far is an important part of trying to address, you know, those concerns and try to make people feel more comfortable about returning to work. Now, ultimately, I know that there are situations where those discussions might not be successful. Like you might still have people who, you know, this isn't a human rights situation. This is not a childcare obligation. They're just saying, I don't feel comfortable returning to work. And that might lead to some difficult discussions about, well, is this person abandoning their job? I mean, you know, I would hope that you don't get to that point. I would hope that the communication that goes on in advance can avoid those kinds of situations. But I know those situations are happening. The federal government has announced that they are trying to bring in new legislation with respect to the CERB that will make people ineligible for it if they refuse a reasonable job offer. And so I think that might help these types of discussions, because I know that has been an issue, that people are saying, I don't really want to return to work when I'm earning, I'm getting the CERB while sitting at home. So that might impact those discussions. But as much as possible, you want to engage with those workers and try to alleviate their concerns. If there are human rights issues, disabilities, family status, you go through the accommodation process like you normally would and come up with a reasonable accommodation plan.
Great, and that's really interesting about the reasonable job offer aspect in that discussion. So I imagine there's some sort of definition to that. Is that right? That people could look to sort of anticipate what that reasonable job offer would look like?
Well, it's very individual based on the circumstances. But one thing that I often see is that an employee will submit, you know, a request for an accommodation, and they will say specifically what they need. I need to start at 10 a.m. and I need to be home at 2 p.m. every day, or that kind of thing. Or they might submit a medical report saying this individual has these restrictions and therefore this is the accommodation plan that the physician is recommending. And those are just recommendations. Ultimately, it's you, the employer, who has, you know, the ability or the right to determine what would be a reasonable accommodation. You consider the employee's perspective, but you also might have operational reasons why that plan just doesn't work. And so, you know, you might not provide the employee with their preferred accommodation plan, but that's not your obligation. Your obligation is to provide a reasonable accommodation.
Okay, thank you. So just the last question, diving into this thread, Kalen, what's the sort of trigger point? Because I understand that each situation is going to be unique. So this doesn't constitute like legal advice necessarily, but what's that trigger point that people should be looking for when a situation would go from those discussions with the employee to maybe, okay, now we need to seek legal advice, or now we need to escalate the process a little bit?
Well, I mean, like that question is sort of up to each individual when they feel like they need some assistance. I mean, I think there's proactive advice that can be provided to avoid the dispute before you get to the dispute. But, you know, I think there are sort of hallmarks or just sort of flags that you want to be on the lookout for. So if someone is saying they can't come to work because of childcare, you're thinking in your mind, potentially there's an entitlement there to an ESA leave, and you're thinking human rights code might be engaged. If someone's saying that they themselves have a medical condition, you're thinking human rights code might be engaged here. I mean, the other issue that you should be aware of, and employees might be aware of this, is that under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, workers do have the right to refuse work if they think the conditions of the workplace are unsafe. Now, there's a specific process to follow in those kind of circumstances, and that isn't something that you would pursue if it's just a general anxiety. But if someone, you know, has a concern about a specific thing in the workplace, for instance, they say, I think we should be having this level of mask in these kind of situations. Well, then that is potentially a Occupational Health and Safety Act work refusal, and you want to follow the process that's laid out in the Occupational Health and Safety Act to resolve that dispute. So I think there's just some flags that you can sort of be aware of, and as soon as you see that flag in your discussion, it sort of will point you in certain directions as to what legal obligations you should be fulfilling.
Great. Thanks, Kalen. Jonathan, as we saw from the poll and as we've been hearing from our conversations, lots of people have been working remotely, whether part-time, some even full-time. And even though we're starting to see a bit of a return to normal, we know that a lot of people are going to continue in some capacity with remote work. And some people are going to be looking at longer-term remote working arrangements. So one of the questions that we had was, what are some of the things that I can do to maintain a positive workplace culture in remote working arrangements, particularly if that's going to be over a longer timeline?
Yeah, for sure. So looking at how your teams function and how the communications inside your teams function is a really important kind of audit to do early on. Maybe you had weekly team meetings for an hour and it was in person, and that has always worked quite well. And suddenly you're finding after a couple of months, you flipped over to Zoom, you're doing the same thing, but for some reason it's just not kind of all adding up in the way that it used to. People are working more and more asynchronously, so they're picking hours that kind of suit them in and around the other things that are happening in their life. For some workplaces, that is brand new. And managers are feeling like they're quote unquote kind of losing control. So, you know, we've been, as we've been coming up with that, you know, in our coaching and in our training, what we're asking of managers is to rethink the way that they're doing their work and the way that they're communicating. You know, for some workplaces, it might mean shorter, more frequent meetings. It might mean driving some transparency into decision-making in a way that you hadn't needed to when the water cooler and the walk by each other was just kind of, you know, helping to kind of grease the communications wheel. You have to put those things into place intentionally now, because, you know, if your workers are sitting at home and they're not benefiting from those natural kind of moments that happen in a physical space, then you need to recreate them, because where there's an absence of information, rumors start, distrust begins, and a team that was once functioning really quite well can soon not be functioning well, to say nothing of, you know, how well are they performing? Are they getting the work done? And so, you know, that's something that comes up a lot. And then I would also just say, you know, a resetting of your expectations around what performance can look like and how long things are going to take. I just think it's going to take us more than 3 months to get really good at this. And I think that, I think we're getting better, but I don't think we're there yet. And for some people, you know, poll I saw yesterday, you know, there's not as big an appetite, I think, as the media would like to have us believe, that folks are hungry to continue this. I have both polls I've seen in the last couple of weeks have really said, actually haven't seen much of an uptick in the desire to continue to work from home. You know, especially because, you know, the work-life balance, I mean, there's a split there on purpose, right? Is that maybe we need both, and maybe they shouldn't become one and the same. And that wonderful New Yorker cartoon from a few weeks ago that, you know, sort of suggested that, you know, I'm now, you know, my home is my work, right? And that's not healthy. That's not great. So employers are starting to ask themselves, what things can we put in place to communicate better? How do we demarcate home and work a little better? And how can we change the expectations around what we think good performance is when people are working remotely or in a blended way?
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, something that I've been hearing a lot about coming up now is that now that sort of the, you know, the initial craziness and uncertainty and almost excitement of like the uncertain has passed and things are a bit more stable. I've noticed that a lot of people have shifted into a sort of second phase where now they're a bit into a routine, and so now they're sort of getting into some demotivation. So there's a bit of a decline in motivation and maybe engagement and that sort of thing. What can leaders and managers do to, if they're faced with that, with their teams that are working partly remotely now and they're starting to face some of that? Like, what would you tell someone who's running into that?
Yeah, it's because you're moving, if you've ever taken Laridae's management training or just any training, right? You're moving out of the you know, urgent box and you're moving back into the important box. And so you need to plan. You need planning. You need to do scenario planning. You need to get out your strat plan. You need to say, okay, maybe this doesn't look the same as we thought it did 2 years ago when we said it. But guess what? This is going to be around for a while. And if we spend the next 18 months without any kind of plan, where will we be? Maybe we find it, it's easy to tell yourself, well, you know, there's so much changing. We don't know what the world's going to look like, you know, in 18 months. How do we plan? I'd argue that's precisely the reason you need to plan. Because if you have no end goal, if you have no place that you're driving yourself towards, then guaranteed you'll reach some unknown place. Whether or not you reach your designed place, having struck a new plan, maybe remains to be seen, but better to have a map than no map. And so the act of planning is healthy. The act of engaging your teams and focusing on the future and focusing on the steps and the achievable things you can do in the next 2 months, in the next 4 months to drive yourself towards a plan is both team building, it's positively motivating, and it helps people connect to the purpose again. So, you know, if they're feeling demotivated, it's because, you know, guess what? The fun part of the work actually was being with your colleagues and seeing the clients and doing the stuff. That's why you got into it. And if you're feeling like you're really detached from that, and after the sort of the crisis starts to abate, as it kind of is, we're into a place now where it's like, how do we reconnect to the purpose? And, you know, for me, the answer is let's do some planning.
That's really interesting. So it becomes a bit of a leadership moment then to reignite that purpose and find new ways to connect people to that purpose when it's not necessarily face-to-face as much as it used to be. Thanks for that. And Kalen, for staff who may need to work at home on a longer term, are there any implications or potential liabilities that an employer should be thinking about?
Well, certainly, you know, the Occupational Health and Safety Act arguably continues to apply. I mean, we've had this debate in terms of to what extent should you as the employer be, performing inspections and that kind of thing, the things that you would do normally in your regular workplace for what, your workplace has now been extended to people's homes. So, I think there is some there's some debate, and truthfully, the Occupational Health and Safety Act is not entirely clear on that point. But in terms of, you know, productivity, motivation, that kind of thing, you want to make sure that your workers are set up at home in a safe working environment. And so again, this gets back to the communication, engaging with your workers on what they need in order to make this work, and what can you provide. I mean, certainly we could have a discussion about, you know, legal obligations, but I think this discussion is going beyond that in terms of, you know, setting up your organization for success in this new reality. In terms of liabilities, I mean, we've been recommending that, like, I think there's insurance implications. So certainly with all the remote working policies that we have been putting in place, we've been telling employers that they should be just running it by their insurance companies to make sure that they don't have anything that they would like to add. And similarly, I think the workers should be touching base with their home insurance brokers on the same issue. And yeah, I mean, for us, the health and safety, and I'm anticipating that we'll get into the health and safety issues at the regular workplace, but you know, you want to consider what precautions can be taken to make sure that home working environment is a safe working environment for your staff.
Thank you. So at the very least, people should have those work from home policies really in place now, and have them reviewed by their insurance company. It's probably a good piece of advice, right?
Well, yeah, and I think you know, whether it's a policy or a letter or something, but I think you want to just sort of set the framework for how this is going to happen, and make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of you know, communication, availability, all those things, so everyone understands, and so you can evaluate and keep improving it as you go along. Because as Jonathan said, we're not going to get this right from the get-go. But you know, I think over the next couple of months, there will be the opportunity to continue to evaluate how it is unfolding, and you want to make sure you have those checks in place so you are able to make those assessments.
Mm-hmm. And Kalen, since you led us there, I'll follow that thread about the workplace and health and safety in the workplace. And we actually did receive some questions about that. One of the questions we got is, when thinking about reconfiguring our workplace and our program spaces, what constitutes a safe workplace?
Yeah, so the provision from the Occupational Health and Safety Act states that every employer should take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. We use the term reasonable quite a bit in our line of work. And so there's no one size fits all solution. It's a matter of assessing what the risks are in your workplace and then putting in controls for those risks. I think this is a time for your Joint Health and Safety Committee to really shine. I think there's a lot of workplaces where the Joint Health and Safety Committee might not have had a lot to do. You know, certainly in our workplace, that was the case. I sit on the Joint Health and Safety Committee for our office, and you know, the health and safety risks before COVID were not significant in a law office. We often talked about tripping hazards and paper cuts and that kind of thing. But our most recent meeting was a very eventful meeting. We had lots to discuss, and we have come up with a policy for our office. And I think, you know, engaging your workers in setting up that plan and setting up what those precautions are, because they're the ones that are going to be expressing the anxiety about coming to work. So you want to make sure that they are involved in that process. And they might be aware of risks that you as managers are not aware of. So I think engaging your workers on what are the risks in our workplace, where do we come into contact with other people, with other pieces of equipment, or just other things that are high touch surfaces, and how can we address those risks? You know, so masks are not required for all, you know, there's no sort of regulation or law saying everyone has to wear a mask in the workplace. It really depends on your workplace. You know, are you able to implement physical distancing in your workplace? If you're not, then you might want to look at things like masks or other PPE, that kind of thing. So you have to sort of assess the risks and then put in controls that are reasonable for those risks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to jump to a question that we got in the chat, and as we're closing in sort of to the final 10 minutes or so here, I just want to make sure if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. So the question here, and I think this will go to Kalen, is someone is saying that the most difficult part for them is when in a 35-hour work week, someone is saying that they can only work 25 hours because of childcare or elderly care or caring for someone in the family. Are we obligated to continue full-time pay?
So no, so someone in that situation, if they are saying that they can't work for these reasons, you know, there is the ability to reduce hours, reduce wages. The Ontario government has just released this new regulation that basically offers some protection for situations where employers are having to reduce hours, reduce wages. And what that regulation has said is, if you are doing so because of COVID-19, and if you have reduced their hours or their wages during what they call the COVID-19 period, which is March 1st until the date that is 6 weeks post state of emergency, and right now we don't know when that state of emergency will end. So if you have to reduce your staff hours or staff wages because of COVID-19 during this period, for the purposes of the Employment Standards Act, that is not considered a constructive dismissal. It is also said that to the extent that you have to eliminate, if someone is saying, you know, I just can't work, or if you need to lay them off, that regulation has said, well, that's not actually a layoff, that is a job protected Employment Standards Act leave. So there are ways to deal with those situations that don't require you to necessarily pay that employee full wages. If you just, you know, if you're in a situation where you can't continue to afford paying someone 100% of their wages for not 100% of their time. You know, I think each situation is different. So I would just caution you to, you know, to review those specific circumstances with a legal professional, but there is that new regulation in place to address those situations that exist across many, many workplaces.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that a lot of organizations have been facing throughout COVID is layoffs. Some people have, you know, gotten away without any, but most organizations have faced it in some form. And I think the hard reality is that there may be more of that coming down in the future. We really don't know. So Jonathan, this next question is for you. Someone asked, what are some of the things that they can do to maintain a positive workplace culture after layoffs, or if I know that layoffs are coming?
Yeah, thanks for that nice hard question, Valentina. That's great.
You're welcome, with no preparation.
No, that's great. Being as transparent as you can, there are things that you can say and things that you can't say, and a lawyer can help you with the legal components of that. It's my observation, though, that there's always a lot more actually that you can say. Maybe not about the specific set of circumstances around those individuals that you had to lay off, but you can certainly communicate what your intention is going forward, how you'd like everybody to move on from this, that you have values and that you treated everybody as fairly as you could, given all of the COVID-related and other circumstances. And, you know, I guess the, you know, act of communicating continuously, you know, both sort of through that period and then beyond, can't be understated. I think sometimes leaders, when they know layoffs are coming, they do the hard emotional work in the lead up to it. And by the time it actually happens, and they have the over Zoom now, you know, conversations that are really, really difficult, and they you know, enact the layoffs, they're kind of done, like they're done it. But and then the, you know, folks that are no longer with the organization are kind of left to go into their own lives to kind of deal with it, and that's sort of off to the side. But all of the survivors, quote unquote, that are inside the organization, that's brand new information for them. And the leader has done all of that emotional work in the rearview mirror, and they're kind of past it, and they forget because they already kind of through it. And they, if that's you, you need to spend, that time that you took, you need to now, you owe that to your team to give them that time that they need to go through the cycle of having all the feelings and to come out the other side, and to give them enough time to do that. Because in some cases, people have worked with people for many, many years, and they might not have seen them in the last couple of months. And it feels like a very weird, strange break that has just occurred in their life. And so, you got to pay a lot of attention to that, and you got to care for the people that are around you, because, as I said earlier, everyone's watching. People really remember.
Thank you. Kalen, a slightly more technical question for you related to layoffs. Someone asked, if we've had layoffs, do I have to call everyone back from layoff at the same time?
No. And I think a lot of workplaces are implementing sort of a phased return to work, and they just don't have enough work to return everyone at the same time. So, so I'll just go back to the point I made earlier, which is that ESA regulation, which was really important, a piece of legislation that just came into place at the end of May, that basically said that if you have laid people off, it actually, after March 1st, due to COVID, it's not actually a layoff. They are actually on this ESA leave. And the reason they brought that in place was because a lot of employers were reaching the 13-week mark. So the ESA says that if your layoff lasts longer than 13 weeks in most situations, it's a deemed termination, which would mean that the employee is now terminated and entitled to their severance payouts. So those employees that may have been laid off due to COVID, they are actually considered to be on this infectious disease emergency leave, which just grants employers a little bit more time to return people, however they need to, in accordance with, the needs of the employer. But I think one consideration that all employers should be aware of is, having a rationale for how you are returning people to work, and why, this group of employees are being returned at this date and this group are being returned at a later date. You don't want to run into a situation where, you're potentially asking a certain group of older workers or workers who have already expressed that they have an underlying medical condition, that's the group of employees that you are saying, oh no, we're going to keep you on leave. You're running into a human rights issue there. So, your reasoning for who gets called back when has to be related to your business, the services, what have you. You want to be able to justify that. So having some sort of documented return to work plan that you can point to in the event that there are some hard feelings over who gets returned to work first and who is sort of staying on leave longer. I think that's helpful, just to sort of stave off those kinds of allegations or accusations down the road.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we know this has been a really challenging time for everyone over the past few months, and the challenges will continue, but we are starting to see some positives, coming out of this too. So Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, now, as we're coming to this sort of fork in the road, what are some hopeful things to come out of this and that we can look forward to in the future?
Yeah. I'm hopeful for a couple of reasons. I think many nonprofits are discovering that they have all kinds of flexibility in their workplaces that they never thought they had. And actually what was the constricting factors was just, we've always done it that way. Or we thought the government wanted us to do that, and it turns out maybe the funders are more flexible than they thought they were, or this just pushed organizations to do things in new and different ways, which I think is really hopeful. I think that teams and whole organizations really are asking themselves, are we really doing the right things in the right way? Are our workflows and work processes actually robust? Are they good? Having to do things remotely has helped organizations skip all kinds of bureaucratic steps that they had just built in over time. And so, getting more efficient and working differently, I'd say is really hopeful. And finally, especially for organizations that are not in the GTA, attracting really great people to do all kinds of jobs, especially in back office services, HR, IT, finance, can be really tough when you're not, in an area where there's a really large kind of pot to draw on. And guess what? You can hire people from wherever you want now. And you've developed the processes and systems to go and find great people that don't live nearby. And if they only come to wherever you are once or twice a year for the annual team check-in, who cares? That's great. You can get the skills and that level of competence that isn't there maybe locally in your candidate pool. And now the whole province and beyond is yours to go and recruit from.
Kalen, as we come to a close here, anything to add to that, or any parting words for people as they venture out into the next phase of this?
Well, in terms of sort of encouraging signs, I'll just add that we had a week at the end of March when it was just, for us, it was a crazy week. It was just call after call after call, and to a certain extent, it was kind of depressing because it was just call after call of, we need to lay everyone off. How do we do this? And you're just going through this issue with so many different employers. But I actually, at the end of that week, I felt it was almost a heartwarming experience, because so many of these calls were managers, business owners, that kind of thing, who are so concerned about their staff, and we're trying to figure out how to move forward in this difficult time and protect their staff as much as possible. How can we get as much money in the pockets of our staff as we can, but continue to move our business along? And it was, we are often called in at times when the employers and the employees are, there's a bit of a dispute going on. And so I just felt very encouraged to see this relationship in this way between managers and their staff. And it just left me feeling like we're going to get through this if we continue with that kind of mentality of really caring for your staff, trying to figure out a way through this that works for everyone. I think there's lots of good things that can come out of this.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we've reached the end of today's webinar, and I'm just going to share on the screen the contact information. I wanted to say thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us today. Thank you to Jonathan and Kalen for being our expert panelists today. If you enjoyed, what you heard today, and if you want to check out our websites or get in touch to hear about future events that we may have like this, I'm going to drop the links to our website in the chat. Also, after this, you're going to be getting a link to a 1-minute feedback survey in your inbox. So if you have a second to let us know what you liked about today's session, please feel free to respond to that. So we'll be bringing this to a close now, but like I said, we will hang around for a few minutes. If you want to stay and say hi to Kalen and Jonathan, feel free. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Allness, for being the tech host. We really enjoyed having this chat. And we wish you the best, and we look to stay in touch with you over the coming weeks as things continue to evolve and change. Okay, so thank you, everyone.